And welcome to Daf Yomi, Week in Lightning Review. This morning we are joined by Dr. Osband, Dr. Yardena Osband, host of one of my favorite Talmud podcasts, to steer us around the week's Daf. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's great to see everyone. Please put in the chat box where you are from. I always like to see where people are from and are tuning in from. I guess we will go ahead and get started. So I'm going to do something a little bit different, and maybe people won't totally like this. But in the last week, there were really some very interesting passages on the topic of illness and what do we do when somebody is sick and how do we treat them. So I wanted to spend some time exploring those. We'll depart a little bit from the topic of Nidarim and just see what the Gemara actually has to say about being sick, visiting the sick, and these types of issues. So the Gemara begins as follows, and right now we're on the bottom of. It really starts this Gemara at the bottom of Lamed Tet Amud Bet 39b. Rav Chilbo Chalash Nefak Achreiz Rav Kahana. So Rav Chilbo got sick, and Rav Kahana went out and he announced it to everybody. Like, he made a public declaration, right? Today we would send a text, we would email. There you had to do it by word of mouth. So Rav Chilbo Ba'esh, right? So he comes and he tells everybody, right? And what happens? Nobody comes basically right, lo eka deka'ate. So he's sick and nobody comes to visit him, okay? Which the Gemara is very puzzled by. Why would nobody come to visit him? Amar lahu, right? So Rav Kahana says to the other rabbis, they're talking about this. Why is it Rav Kahana went out, he announced that Rav Chilbo is sick, nobody bothered to come visit him? Lo kachaya masa b'talmid achad mitalmidei Rabbi Akiva shechala. Wasn't there a story once with one of the students of Rabbi Akiva, who also became sick? Lo nichnasu chachamim levakro, v'nichnas Rabbi Akiva levakro. The rest of the sages to visit him, but Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe, came to visit him. Ubishvil shekibdu v'ripsu lefanav chaya. And because and it's interesting what it says here, kibdu v'ripsu lefanav chaya. So what is it that he did? He swept and he sprinkled water on the floor. In other words, we know that people at that time had dirt floors, okay? And part of what you needed to do was you needed to keep the dirt sort of padded into the ground. Otherwise, the dirt would sort of get everywhere. They didn't have tiles the way that we do. I'm sure some very wealthy people had tiles, but your regular average person just sort of had these dirt floors. So the Gemara talks about this in Masachet Shabbat. If you're allowed to actually sprinkle the water and pat it down on Shabbat, you're not. Surprising, okay? But here, what did Rabbi Akiva do? He went, and it wasn't so much that he went to visit him, right? Levakro, he went to visit him. But what else did he do? He swept and he sprinkled the water. And because of that, the student recovered. Amar lo, right? And the student said to Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Hechtani, right? My teacher, you revived me. You made me alive. Yatsa Rabbi Akiva v'darash. Rabbi Akiva went out and he gave the following teaching. Kol mi she'em mevaker cholim ki'ilu shofech damim. Anybody who does not visit the sick, it is actually like you killed, right? You spilled blood. So we learn a few interesting things from here. First is that I think Rabbi Akiva's methodology here, right? It's not just about visiting, but your visiting has to be purposeful, right? You have to be useful. You have to actually go there with the intention of helping the person. So I think maybe some of us who have had, unfortunately, the experience of being sick, right? We all know about the visitor who overstays their visit or, comes at the wrong time or, sort of comes and just wants to sit on the couch and talk the whole time. And that might not be actually what the sick person needs. And what Rabbi Akiva is teaching here is that to visit, right, to do Bikur Cholim, okay, is not actually about visiting with the person, but it's actually about doing something useful to the person. The second piece of this teaching that I think is important is what Rabbi Akiva is showing us is that doing nothing is also doing something, right? if you don't take the time to go visit a person who's sick, you may be responsible for this person not being revived, not living. Now, what does Rabbi Akiva mean by this? Does he mean because you physically didn't take care of that sick person's needs? That could be one interpretation of what Rabbi Akiva is saying here, because Rabbi Akiva went to this student's house and actually performed a concrete action. Could it mean that Rabbi Akiva is saying just for the person's spirit? That's possible too, and I could be open to that interpretation as well. But the point here is that Rabbi Akiva is saying that by not visiting, you're actually doing something negative. The not visiting, the not going to fulfill to see the sick person, not going out of your way to do that, actually within itself is a bad action. That is like doing shvichut damim. It is like actually going ahead and killing somebody. And so I think it's very interesting the way that Rabbi Akiva explains this. Now we go on to another story here, Ki ata Rabdimi, when Rabdimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. So we have many stories like this in the Gemara. Rabdimi went to Eretz Yisrael and then he came back to Bavel. Anyone who visits somebody who's sick and causes him to live, and anyone who does not visit the sick causes him to die. So this seems to be very similar to what Rabbi Akiva was saying. But the Gemara wants to know, my Gorma, how does he actually cause this? How do you cause somebody to live by visiting? How do you cause somebody to die by not visiting? So we could say that it's when you go to the sick person and you visit the sick person, what else do you do while you're there? You're going to pray. You're going to pray to God that this person should have mercy. When you see a person suffering in front of you, who's sick in front of you, a normal, empathic person, what are they going to do? They're going to go to prayer right away. Okay. And if you don't, right, what are you going to do? Right? It's you, right? You're going to basically, you will sort of in a way, right? You're going to pray that he will actually die. Now, the Gemara, okay, they can understand the first part of this, right? If you're there, you're going to pray for rachamim that the person will live. But if you don't go, are you actually really praying that this person should die? Ella kol she'em mevaker chola, em mevakesha levrachamim lo sheyichla v'lo sheyamut. No, what the idea is that if you don't visit that person, if that person is not on your mind, you're not going to pray for that person at all. And so I think this passage of the Gemara is speaking a little bit towards, I think at least, the isolation of the experience of being ill, right? That very often when people are ill and they're stuck at home or they're in a hospital, they're not really part of the community anymore, right? It's very easy to forget about them. It's very easy to forget what they need and to daven for them and to think about them. And so what this Gemara is basically saying is that part of the reason that we go to visit people is for ourselves as well. It's so that we remember this person, we remember to pray for this person. It's also saying something about who actually cures people. Right now, again, medicine in the time of the Gemara is very, very different than medicine that we have today, right? But ultimately, who lives and who dies, right? We see this in our liturgy, is obviously up to God. And so therefore, we still need to have this element of prayer, even with medicine or anything else that may try to help the person. That's at least what this Gemara is trying to tell us. And then finally, and I'll pause after this paragraph, Rava, right now we have a story with Rava. Rava says, Yoma kadma dechalish amar lahun. On the first day that he was sick, he would say to his family, Lo tigalu le'inish, don't tell anybody I'm sick, dila tira mazle, so that my luck doesn't suffer, right? That he doesn't have bad mazel. Now, mazal is a term that is used in the Gemara. The Gemara believes that people can have the English translation of luck is not a good English translation, but that people can have different mazal, right? You can sort of have, I almost would say it's almost like a different energy in the world that sort of either helps you or doesn't help you. And so what Rava is saying is he would tell his family if he got sick, it's better for you not to reveal to other people, okay, that I'm sick, because maybe it will change my my mazal, because maybe somebody will be happy that he was sick, or something like that, or they won't pray for him. Mikan ve'elach amar lahun. from this point onward, if he got sicker, he would say to his family, Puku ba'achrizu bishuka, go and tell everybody in the shuk that I'm sick, because anybody who hates me will basically rejoice over the fact that I am sick. All right. Ketiv, and he quotes here a pasuk from Mishlei, chapter 24, verse 17, 18. Right. So this is a pasuk. You could see more of the English here, right? It's telling you not to rejoice when your enemy falls, and your heart shouldn't be happy when he stumbles, because God could see this, and this displeases God, right? But uterachim li levaya elai rachme. But let all who love me, should pray that God should actually have mercy on me. I find this passage of Rava to be very, very interesting. I think, this is also a particular attitude that I think we see sometimes when people are sick, right? Sometimes we encounter people who are sick. They like to be private about it, right? So the Jewish joke would be, right? Somebody has, they have the machla, they have the sickness. We don't name it. We don't say it out loud. But I think it's interesting to see that kind of like inclination towards privacy, or this idea that like, if you talk about it too much, it somehow changes your mazel, like putting out bad words or negative energy or negative words somehow changes how you're going to survive. This is old ancient tradition, right? We see that Rava, firmly believe this. But then I think what Rava comes to say is that if it really gets to a point where he's really sick and he is in the need of other people's tefillot, okay, then his family can go ahead and they can tell people. And again, we've seen people like this who, we didn't know somebody was suffering with an illness until right at the end, or till they really got sick. And then we find out, they actually were sick for years or months or something like that. So to me, I was very taken by sort of seeing this attitude that Rava had. Okay, I'm just going to check the chat box before we go on here. I need to admit this person. Okay, why is my chat box not working? Okay, is there any chats there that I should know about?
Aaron Boxer asks, if someone else visited, am I no longer required to visit the person who's ill?
Oh, that's a great question. The Gemara seems to say, from the way Rabbi Akiva talks about it, it's on each and every individual. That's how I would understand that Gemara. Right? Because the way Rabbi Akiva says, where he says, specifically, excuse me, because he says, Kol mi she'em mevaker. It's on the individual. Anyone who does not visit the sick, ki'ilu shofech damim. Any other
that's all the questions you have.
Okay, excuse me. Oh, okay.
Oh, folks wanted to know the name of your podcast, but we helped them out.
Talking Talmud. It's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. So it's not a complete review of the daf every day. It's me and my chavruta and Gordon. We talk about important points on the daf every day. So if you're looking for something to supplement your regular Daf Yomi learning, or if you're Daf Yomi curious, it's a good place to start, if I don't say so myself. Okay.
That's MJL style too, except we do it in the written form. Something interesting every day, but not a complete review.
And the goal is, we call it Talking Talmud to say everybody has something interesting to say about the daf, no matter what your background is. Okay. Now we'll go down to a little bit further on this daf. And we're going to again have some more sayings about visiting the sick. Amar Rav Shisha Bereda Rav Idi. So Rav Shisha, the son of Rav Idi, said, Lo lisod inish kirtzar ala betlata shai kadmate, velo betalit shali batrata diyoma. You should not go visit a sick person either during the first 3 hours of the day or in the last 3 hours of the day. Okay, now for us, this kind of seems like common sense, right? It's not good to visit a person first thing in the morning, right when they wake up. Often sick people need a little bit longer to get up, get their day together. And also not at the end of the day, because often sick people need to go to bed earlier or tire out differently. But he has a different reason. Here he says, Ki heichadelo lasachtate min rachme, because it will take away, here they use the English word divert, but it's sort of like the sick person will be preoccupied with you visiting instead of them actually praying for rachamim. And then he goes on to say, tlache kadmata ravcha date. During the first 3 hours, the sick person is relieved because, in other words, he suffered during the night. And then what happens? I said this wrong. The person who's visiting him is not going to pray for him. And why is it? Because when he comes for the first 3 hours of the day, the person, sometimes in the morning, people look a little bit better. And so the person who's visiting him is going to say, okay, maybe he's getting better. I don't have to pray for him, right? And then he says, batrata, right? The last 3 hours of the day, takev chulshe, right? That's when he's particularly weak, right? And then maybe the person is going to think, you know what? My prayers aren't going to work. Prayer is futile. So I found this passage to be interesting because, again, I do think there is some actual wisdom in there about what is the best way to actually visit a sick person, right? Visiting first thing in the morning or at night is generally not the best time to go see people. It's interesting that, again, it centers around prayer. And again, I think the reason why we see this emphasis in these passages is that one is medicine was so different that honestly, a lot of what anybody could do was really just to pray. There was not kind of like as much treatment as we have today. You know, there's concept of a hospital didn't exactly exist or anything like that. But I think because of that, because we have such technology, and I say this as a doctor myself, I think we have sort of forgotten in a way, right, the power or the purpose of prayer itself, and that ultimately we are responsible for praying to God because we have to believe that sort of what happens is ultimately going to be up to God, right? Like we can't explain why somebody, with the same diagnosis, right? Two people with the same type of cancer, God forbid, one person will live and one person will die. And so I think the Jewish belief here that's being communicated is that's why prayer is important because we ultimately don't know. But again, I think when we read a passage like this, it might feel a little bit primitive because it's like, okay, all they had to do was pray. But I think in our modern world, we have sort of forgotten sort of a little bit that art of prayer when it comes to those of us who are beloved and sick. The Gemara goes on and says the following, Amar Ravin, Amar Rav. So Ravin said that Rav said, Minayin shakadosh baruch hu zan et hacholah, right? So where do we know that God sustains, right? Zan is literally from the word mizonot. If you were doing Daf Yomi and did ketubot, right? We saw that word a lot about like what the husband has to provide the wife, right? Okay. So that God sustains the sick person. Shana Amar. And here they quote a pasuk from Tehillim, chapter 41, verse 4. Hashem yisadena al eresh divai, right? God will support him on the bed of suffering. So it means that sort of like God yisadenu is from the word Uda, that God literally sustains him, gives him food, right? But Amar Ravin, and Ravin says, what else did Rav say? Minayin shashchina shruya lamala mimitato shel chola, right? Where do we know that the Shechina actually rests on the bed of the sick person? Shenamar Hashem yisadenu al eretz davya, right? And again, he quotes this pasuk to say that God supports him, supports the bed, right, or sustains the bed of the sick person. So on the one hand, Rav is saying it could literally mean physically sustains him. On the other hand, it could mean that God's presence is very much there. I find this passage to be very, very beautiful because I think often when we see particularly very bad suffering or pain, right? So our human emotion, our human way of acknowledging that is to say it's good or it's bad, and pain and suffering is bad, and it's not good. And this Gemara is giving us like a particular passage to say, okay, maybe you're experiencing it as bad, but try to remember that God's presence, the Shechina, is actually with you. And I think that this passage to be very, very comforting that even within an experience that we feel is bad, right, within our human subjectivity, we can still feel that God's presence can be there. Now, I understand this may not appeal to everybody, and all of us have gone through things in life, myself included, and around illness where I'm like, I'm not exactly feeling God's presence here, okay? So I want to say that very explicitly. But, I do think there's a particular beauty here to what Rav is trying to say, that he's sort of saying like that Shechina is really always there with the sick person. And then finally, we have a brisa that teaches something similar. Tanya Nami Hachi, right? A brisa also taught, and this is an interesting brisa because it sort of combines the halachot. And there are people who like, this is like, some of this is written in like the Shulchan Aruch, okay? Like it's codified into law. How do we actually visit a person? And then also, what's the mood in the room when we visit a person? Somebody goes to visit a sick person. Lo yeshev lo al gabe mita, velo al gabe safsal, velo al gabe kisei. Right? That person should not sit on the bed or on a bench or on a chair. The idea is their beds were like low on the ground. You're not supposed to be higher than the sick person, okay? Because that's like not supposed to be nice that you're like higher than that person. Ela mitatefi yoshev al gabe karka. Rather, you're supposed to wrap yourself in your garment. You could also say maybe that's with the talit. We use the same word there for wrapping, and you sit on the ground. Because again, the Shekhinah is over. So if you are higher than the bed, you are basically putting yourself what? Higher than God. And that's not considered to be respectful. And then again, we quote the same pasuk, Shenemar Hashem Yisadenu al Eresh Tavai. So it's interesting that again, this brisa sort of combines in a way practical halacha of like, how do we visit a person, right? With sort of this beautiful teaching that the reason why we're going to do some of these practical things is because God's presence is actually in the room itself. And so I was very taken by this brisa that it sort of was like a beautiful combination of like the practical, but also what that moment of that there's a spiritual moment to be had there when we do visit sick people. Okay, before I move on to the next step, any questions, comments? I'm having an issue with chat. I don't know why it's not letting me check the chat today. So let me know if anybody said
Nice
anything.
comments, but nothing I think requires immediate response.
Okay.
Oh, why is
All right.
this teaching? Wait, one just came in. Why are we talking about this in Nidarim?
Oh, okay. How did we get right? So again, this is like typical Gemara where like we had a discussion because it started off with the discussion if you made a neder about benefit, what happens if somebody's sick? Can you visit them? And then it like digresses into this whole thing about visiting people. If I wanted to give like a little bit of like a meta reason, but I don't know that this is true, the whole Masechet of Nidarim is around this weird concept that people would express words, and by those words, they would be prohibited to benefit from their chaver. That's literally the word. It always says from chavero, from their fellow man, or they prohibit that chaver from benefiting from them. And so I feel like in a way, Bikur Cholim is like the exact opposite of that, right? It's like the most act of giving that you can give to a person who is sick and who's suffering. So the neder in a way is like a breaking of that relationship. And Bikur Cholim is how we cement our relationship with other people because we show that we care for other people. And I think that's why Rabbi Akiva's statement that it's like, if you don't go to visit, it's not just that you didn't go to visit, you actually did shvichut damim. You actually killed somebody because you so didn't look out for each other. So to me, I think that's kind of the meta thing that's going on here. In a way, the Gemara is taking like a digression onto this because it's sort of the opposite of what happens when we make a neder with somebody. Okay, now we get to two very, very interesting stories here that I was very, very taken by. So there's a very famous Amora in Bavel, Rav Yosef, who very often we will see passages in the Gemara that he's with his student Abaye, and often Abaye will sort of have to like remind him of his halacha. And often it will start with him saying, like Rav Yosef says, Lo shmi'eli hadash ma'ate. I didn't learn this before. And now the Gemara is going to tell us, why do these stories happen? Rav Yosef chalash. Rav Yosef was ill. Ikar le Talmudei. And because of his studies, because of this illness, his studies were forgotten. Now, what does this mean in the Gemara? Did he have a form of dementia? Was there some type of neurological disease? The doctor in me is very curious to know what exactly happened to Rav Yosef, but there's definitely a connection between his illness and his ability to recall his Torah knowledge anymore. Adre Abaye Kame. So Abaye came and reviewed it with him. And again, I think in its own way, and I always think about when I read these types of passages, how could I apply this to sort of the modern world, right? this is giving us a particular derech of what do we do with people with, with dementia, or, people who are forgetting things or neurologically not in the same place that they were before when it comes to their cognitive abilities. And Abaye reviews with him. He tries to keep his mind active. Hainu de b'chol duchta amrina. And so this is when we say everywhere, right? When we say Amar Rav Yosef lo shma li hada shma'ate, right? Anywhere where it says that Rav Yosef says, I didn't learn this halacha, Amar le Abaye, Abaye would say to him, At amarta nahalan, he would say, you said this to us, umehal matnita amrita nahalan, and this is the brisa you taught us to teach it. So so again, pay attention to this while you're doing Daf Yomi, or anytime, if you ever see sort of these exchanges between Rav Yosef and Abaye, this Gemara Nedarim gives you sort of the background to it, that Rav Yosef suffered from an illness. Abaye took it upon himself to help him to restore his memory, to restore his teaching by constantly reviewing with him. And look at the respectful way. His approach was not to pretend that it wasn't happening, right? Which I also think is interesting. He's very explicit. He says to Rav Yosef, no, you actually did teach this to me. And this is how you taught it to me, which I think is an interesting approach. I don't know if there's anybody who's listening with us today who does work with people with cognitive impairment, and I know there's always discussion around, do you sort of go with the flow? Do you let people know that they forgot something? So I found this approach to be very, very interesting. And then finally, we have another story, and this is what we'll conclude with today. Ki have gamir Rabbi slat asrei ape hilchate. So this is a story. Now we're moving to the Tanaim, so we're going a little earlier. And it's about Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who we say sort of formed or redacted the Mishnah. And he had developed 13, either 13 chapters or 13 sections of the Mishnah, okay? Agmare le Rabbi Chia Shiva Minhun. And he taught 7 of them to Rabbi Chia. Okay, so Rabbi Chia, remember, we say he's the author of the Tosefta, or he put the Tosefta together. So here we have Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He has 13 of, pieces of the Mishnah to teach. He teaches Rabbi Chia 7 of them. L'sov chalash Rabbi. In the end, he gets sick. And there's actually many passages. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was not in great health. There's some passages about how he suffered from intestinal disease. So this is one of the other passages that discusses that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was sick. Hadar Rabbi Chia kame hanu shiva apedza gamer. And so what does he do? He falls sick. Rabbi Chia goes back and teaches him the 7 things that he taught him. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was able to remember them again. Shita azdu, but 6 of them were lost. The 6 other things that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had, that he had worked on, that he had memorized, that he had formulated, those were lost because he never taught Rabbi Chia. And now this is amazing. Hava halku katzra. There was a launderer, right? Hava shmiele l'Rabbi kedahave garis lahu. And he would overhear Rabbi Yehuda Nasi repeat to himself all of these teachings. Now, I think this tells us something fascinating about, not just about illness, okay? But it also teaches us something fascinating about how Mishnah was actually written. Mishnah, when we talk about the oral Torah being written down, remember, this is before a printing press. So it's not like it was written in a book and everybody had a book of Mishnah. If you really look at the Mishnah, many academics talk about, it's written in a way that it was meant to be memorized, right? It often has lists of 3, they're short. There's a lot of things that you can look at there that show that it's very similar to other types of oral traditions. So yes, we talk about it being written down. The idea is that it was formalized, it was put into a particular language, right? But it still was meant to be memorized. And so therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, to teach it to himself, he would say it out loud, and this wanderer overheard him saying everything. And it goes on, and then we're going to get to what the second amazing thing is. So the first amazing thing here is that Mishnah, right? How is Mishnah sort of written, right? It was just Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sort of repeating to himself and going over those Mishnahs over and over again, right? And then all right, va'ata avadar yaton kame Rabbi. So that launderer comes, and what did he do? He reviews those 6 missing pieces with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So every time Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would see this launderer, he would always say, Ata asita oti v'etchia. You made me and you made Rabbi Chia. Ika da'amri, others would say, Hachi ka'amar le, Ata asita Chia v'Chia asali. I made Chia and Chia made me. But I think this is saying something else very interesting about Mishnah. The idea here is that even the launderer, right, could learn Mishnah and memorize it, and he teaches it to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. We say Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is often compared to Moshe, right? He is one of our greatest Torah teachers. And so I think the insight here into is not just how the Mishnah was written, that it was transmitted orally, wasn't written down on a piece of paper. That's why when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi couldn't remember anymore, it got forgotten because it wasn't written down. But the idea is that the fact that the launderer can come and restore it shows that Mishnah was actually meant for everybody, right? Anybody had the ability to actually memorize Mishnah. And so I think there's sort of a hidden message here, right? That the restoration of this knowledge did not come from the rabbinic class, but it came from the ordinary man. It came from the launderer. And that person was worthy of the praise of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And so I think it teaches us, it's not just that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came and, formulated the Mishnah, but Rabbi Yehuda Nasi formulated the Mishnah in a way, in an oral tradition, that it then became accessible to each and every Jew. And we see that in particular, because once he becomes ill, it's the everyman, it's the launderer who comes to restore that knowledge and teach it back to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, as opposed to his own actual student. Okay, so today, just to sum up, very, very quickly, we did a bunch of the Gemaras about visiting the sick. How do we visit the sick? The presence of God over the bed of the sick, whether that could be comforting, maybe for some of us that's not so comforting. And then finally, sort of some examples of like cognitive illness that we see. And the idea is that cognition could be restored by reviewing. But the more important point is that it's an ordinary person, right, who is able to restore that knowledge to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, which I think is something that should give us all a lot of chizuk, like a lot of strength in our own learning, that really each and every one of us, right, we could be capable of even teaching the Mishnah to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to stop the share right now. And I hope to see you all next month. Okay, now I can look at the comments.
Because you were in full screen mode.
I know, but I've done that before. I don't know what happened. Okay, anyhow.
No, I think it's changed in Zoom. I've had more problems with it recently too.
Oh, okay. That's good to know.
I think so. Thank you so much, Dr. Osmond. I thought your conversation at the end really got me thinking about, I've always thought of Talmud as sort of this very elite text. And this reminder that, like the rabbis, it is elite in the sense that it's very difficult to access, but we can see this ideal that everyone should have access.
Yes, I 100% agree with you.
But it's hard,
I think there's a
right?
message here. Anybody could have access.
It's a lot. And yes, this idea that texts were meant to be memorized and known orally. I think we touched on that in a piece that had to do with Bible study a few weeks back, as well. Is also really interesting that this is the way of embodying and interacting with the tradition, because it's so different from how we do it now. Most people aren't memorizing rabbinic texts and Torah texts in the same way that they were back then. I'm
just looking at some of the comments here. MJ, I really like what you said, that this idea that God is above the bed, so we need to make room for God. So maybe actually that Gemara is almost like a challenge to us, right? That for those of us who don't feel God's presence when we're encountering illness, the challenge for us is for us to say, but I know it's there, and how am I going to access that? So I appreciate you saying it that way.
All right, we are at 10:05, so we need to let you go. Thank you, Dr. Osmond. Thank you to all of you for the thoughtful conversation and chat. And we will see you in your inbox tomorrow and in this space.
Thank you, everybody. Looking forward to learning with you again next month.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.